Okay, well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. I'm Jay Warmke with solarpvtraining.com. And as per usual, just to give you a little bit of background in case you're new to this, to the format of what we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and walk through the news of the week, what's happening in the world of solar. Then I'll try and recap whatever events I'm aware of that are coming up, webinars, conferences, things of that nature that are related to solar. And then we touch on a topic, sometimes very specifically technical. And like today, it's going to be a little more esoteric. Today's topic is going to be talking about the Great Grid Crisis of 2030. So I don't know, we'll do it as a retrospect, but I wanted to, I feel like there are a lot of things aligning where there is a greater than zero chance that we're going to be facing some interesting issues when it comes to the world of electricity. So I thought I would bring that up and we can address it. So let's jump into the news for the week of May 26th, which was Sunday, this Memorial Day week. Okay, so according to data just released by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, solar accounted in the first quarter of this year for about 86.8% of all of the new generating capacity that was added to the grid. And for the month of March of this year, 2024, solar accounted for 99.7% of all of the new electrical generation. So the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, had projected last year that in 2024, solar plus storage, or solar and storage, would account for about 80% of new generating capacity. So far this year, we're pretty much right on track on that to meet or exceed those expectations. With 87% of new generation for the first quarter, during that first quarter, wind accounted for about 12.4%. And interestingly, natural gas was less than 1% of new additions. I know we've talked in past that it really is now a battle between wind and solar, with solar taking the lion's share. Natural gas as an industry, as a generating source, is on the decline when it comes to new energy, the same way that coal was in years past. So currently, the grid capacity based on fuel source is natural gas, still the big dog. When I say that, it's new energy that's on decline for natural gas, but existing power plants are really dominating with natural gas. 44% more or less for natural gas. Coal still represents just under 16%. Wind, just under 12%. Solar, a little bit more than 8%. Nuclear about 8%, and hydro right about 8%. So those three, solar, nuclear, and hydro, right about the same amount of generating capacity. But you should note that FERC does not track residential or commercial solar in these numbers. These are all just utility scale numbers. So it's estimated that about a third of all the generating capacity from solar is in these smaller systems, commercial systems, the systems on your home. So really, if you were to put that number in here, it would be closer to 12% that solar represents on our grids generating. And they're anticipating, FERC is anticipating, over the next 3 years, there is a very high probability that utility scale solar will grow to about 14%. So that's up from 8% to 14 just in 3 years. Or if you add in the residential commercial, it's going to be about 20% of the generating by April 1st of 2027. It will then, solar within these 3 years will surpass all other forms of energy generation on the grid, with the exception of natural gas. So that's pretty dramatic in a short period of time. It's been a bit over a year since California implemented Net Metering 3.0, or NEM 3.0, that drastically reduced the amount of money that the utilities would pay to customers who have solar, who export that power back to the grid. They reduced that by about 75% of what they're being paid. So at the time, a year ago, advocates were saying, listen, this is going to decimate the solar industry within this state. And pretty much all those predictions have come to pass. It's estimated that about 17,000 solar installer jobs have been lost over the last year in the state, where people either lost their jobs or moved to other states. And a recent report by Lawrence Berkeley Labs now found that new installations are down about 75% in the state of California. Down in the last 6 months, there have been about 50,000 requests for interconnections. That's down from about 200,000 the same period of time 1 year earlier. The study also found that there's been a dramatic increase in the amount of storage capacity that are being added to these solar arrays that are being added to the grid. Makes sense. The system owners are saying, listen, if you're only going to pay me this small amount of money for power that I export back to you, I'm just going to keep it. I'm going to put in storage, and now I'm going to hold that power and then use it when I need it at night or whatever, rather than using the grid as a virtual battery, which is what the net metering process allows folks to do. So when you're overproducing, you send it to the grid. It acts like a battery. When I need it, I pull it from the grid. And as long as the exchange rate is pretty normalized, that works out quite nicely. But now California has disincentivized people to export to the grid. So not unusual that they're actually then not doing it. Voltage limits in residential PV systems in the US remain at about 600, well, maximum of 600 volts DC. The commercial systems can be up to 1,000 volts DC, but there's no voltage limit on ground-mounted systems. So we're talking about larger systems, usually utility scale systems. But the equipment is all standardized at 1,500 volts DC. But this may be changing. Jinko Solar just announced the Eagle Series modules are the first in the world that have been tested and rated up to 2,000 volts. So it's significant because the higher the voltage when you're designing a system, the higher the voltage, the smaller the amps, or the less the amps, so the smaller the wire for the same amount of power that's being produced. So when you have smaller wire, that's cheaper. When you have longer strings, that's less components that get added into it. So basically, the higher the voltage, the cheaper the cost per watt of generation. Now, these higher voltage panels are expected to be available on the market here in the US in 2025. And Amazon announced its first solar plus storage plus AI system. And this is a system that's installed at a place called Baldy Mesa Solar Farm, which is located in Southern California in the Mojave Desert. And what they're doing is they're using AI machine learning models to predict how and when to charge or discharge batteries within this system. They're expecting this AI model will analyze about 33 billion data points over the course of a year, and in order to maximize the efficiency of the system. Amazon has said that if this pilot project works out well, then they're intending on integrating AI with all of their installed systems across the globe. And that is the news from the solar industry for this week. Does anybody have anything they wanted to add to that mix here before we move on? Give you just a second. Okay, so as you're thinking about that or coming up with something, or even if you don't, let's go over some of the events that are coming up here in the weeks to come. So I'm going to increase the size of my screen here so that I can see it. Yeah, May 29th, which is tomorrow, there is a webinar here from Standard & Poor's Global, Interconnection Backlog. That's at noon Eastern Time. All of these are going to be Eastern Time as far as your reference, and you can look them up. I don't have the specific connections on these. AEP Ohio and Clean Fuels Ohio are going to have a webinar on their new EV charging rate program. I did attend one of these before. It's kind of interesting because they're anticipating EVs to become a bigger and bigger thing. This is really focused on commercial charging stations. And we've talked to different folks about how demand charges might really impact when you're integrating charging stations into an existing gas station, for example, or 7-Eleven or whatever, it could really see a spike in your electric, because the demand charges, and the way demand charges are, you get billed for the highest 15-minute period of time over the course of a month. Well, if somebody plugs in an EV, obviously the charging, the use of electricity spikes for that period of time. So you could see your electric bills double. So the solution for this would basically be, when you've got these commercial EV charging stations, you essentially have a separate meter for them, put them on a separate utility. And now AEP is anticipating that there will need to be a different billing structure for these meters that are servicing EV charging. So you can find out more about that. Codes and Standards session. This is on, it's a virtual conference, and it's May 29th and 30th, put on by CEA. And Solar United Neighbors is putting on a workshop webinar about REAP grants, the Rural Electric Energy for America program. These REAP grants are available to rural businesses and agricultural businesses, and they will fund up to 50% of the cost of installing solar on your home. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend you attend. Wood Mackenzie's putting on one about module breakage, how to deal with this. I think that's an issue that's going to be more and more of an issue, because, of course, the manufacturers have tried to make the cost of these less and less and less. So the glass gets thinner, the aluminum frame gets thinner, everything gets thinner, and that, of course, leads to increased breakage during transportation and installation. There's another virtual solar conference put on by Aurora Solar, and this is coming up June 5th and 6th. And then there's a webinar June 6th on carbon offsets, if you're interested in that. And renewable data management using AI. This is one by Solar Power World, coming up on June 11th at 2 p.m. And then there's a conference in San Francisco on solar and storage. And then another webinar, innovative balance of system components. So how to integrate those things in, on June 13th at noon. Another conference here in Philadelphia, Renewable Energy, or RE Plus Mid-Atlantic, July 18th and 19th. There's this document that you can get from Solar Builder, which is talking about how to maximize your investment on solar batteries. And then, of course, our shameless plug for solarpvtraining.com, where we have ongoing courses and online courses and things of that nature. So I won't bore you with that, but that's always available. Okay, so that is the events, and I'll throw it open to folks again here if you've got anything you want to add into that mix before we jump into the main event. Giving you just a second. Everybody gets so shy. The more people we get on here, the less likely you are to talk. So don't be so shy. Okay, so as I said, I was attending the ACES Solar Conference last week in Washington, D.C. And so there was a lot of discussion. I mean, their theme in theory of the conference was connecting technology with policy. I didn't see a lot of technology discussions. There were just very few. It was very much more a academic exercise, but it started me thinking about the direction of the industry and where we're going, how we're dealing with it. And I think one of the things that it brought home to me, because there were some policy decision makers who were speaking there, and I came away feeling like they didn't really have a clue what they were doing, which is a little bit frightening. You know, you kind of hope that there are adults in the room and that they've got their finger on the pulse, and don't worry, kids, everything will be fine. And then you begin to see that maybe they don't. I don't know that they're badly intentioned. I think that they live in a different world than the rest of us. And the best of them look at it and say, there's no way I'm going to get the ideal passed through any of these mechanisms we've got, the regulatory process, the legislative process. So I'm going to deal with reality as I see it, and I'm going to make all these compromises to get what I could do. What can be done, let's do it. Let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good, that kind of thing. Others just don't even have the technical background to understand what we're facing. But the more I think about it and the more we look at these kind of discussions each week, I just keep thinking that we're facing more difficult issues than I think most people realize. When we talk about resiliency, when we talk about systems seem to work just fine until they don't. And we see this in monetary systems, we see it in political systems, and we're going to see it in our energy systems. You can say, listen, the grid has worked for 100 years. Everything's chugging along. Sure, we have little problems, but we always address them. And that's the reality until it's not. And I just feel like there are a lot of things converging here that could create a bit of a crisis. And I don't want to sound all zombie apocalyptic on this, but I always like to say that there's a reason why you carry a spare tire in your car, because things happen. It doesn't require it being the end of the world, but you've got to be prepared. You've got to be prepared for this. But before I jump into it, I wanted to back up and just do a little summary here about the last time we got together. We talked about installing a solar pavilion, and I had left it out there that we got the whole thing installed. It was late at night. This sounds like a cliffhanger, right? But we got at the end, and everybody was too tired to finish it, and it wasn't actually working. It was giving off all of these alarms that there was no battery present and all of that. So I was thinking, oh my gosh, is this thing going to work? Well, Ted, and I know, Ted, you're on the call here. And I wanted to thank you for showing up. So Ted and I went out there last Thursday in Eastern West Virginia, and finished the commissioning process on this. And it works. Everything works. And we did get some suggestions on the YouTube channel. It was interesting because somebody wrote in and said, hey, I'm sure you're aware of this, which is something you should never say to me because I'm not aware of a lot of things. But that there is a communication port that has to be connected between the battery and the inverter, because these batteries, the lithium-ion batteries, are not just dumb batteries. They're not just lead-acid batteries that you just hook up, which is the way you traditionally have done this with lead-acid batteries. You just take the positive, the negative, hook it into the inverter, and everybody recognizes everything. Well, in this case, we needed to take an RJ45 jack that connects into the battery management unit, and it then connects into the inverter. And it begins this dialogue between the battery and the inverter. Well, that was a big issue, a big reason why the system did not recognize that there was a battery. Then we had to go in and we had to program the system, the inverters, that say, okay, what kind of battery should I be looking for? What size? All of that kind of thing. So that was wandering through, and Ted did most of that, going through all the menu items and selecting, and just so that when it does recognize this battery, it knows what it should be looking for and it communicates properly. And then there was one other little thing. There's a dip switch on the battery, and you have to set one of the dip switches to tell it that this is the master battery. Because if you were to daisy chain a number of these batteries together, the first one that's communicating with the inverter has to be designated as the master, and then all of the other batteries would be slave. So, then that was kind of what we needed to do, and we got everything working. It took it a little while to recognize itself, and fortunately, you can turn off the alarm while all of that is screaming at it. Then we hooked up the modem, and the modem was another little bit of a challenge. Because this pavilion is a fair distance away from the main building. So we had some connectivity issue there because it's right at the outside range of the Wi-Fi of the college. So, but it's all working well. Everything's reporting. I'm happy. And so now we're one step closer. So I just wanted to catch you up to date on that. Okay, so let's look at some of the things with the current grid. And once again, I just want to remind you guys, I'd welcome any interruptions or thoughts as we're going through this, because part of the nice thing about this format is can be a conversation. So, so if we look at the historical demand, I think it's important to realize that if you just look at demand, I'll zoom in on that, of the grid and what has met that demand really from 1950 all the way up to present day, more or less. We saw a tremendous ramp up in the amount of electricity that was required from about 1950 to about 2000. But in the last 20 years, demand has been holding pretty steady. So we've seen efficiencies going on where any increased demand that we would see on the grid has been offset by these efficiencies. So we've seen a generation or more of policymakers and utility managers and all of these kind of guys focusing on a situation where the grid is stable. There have been underlying transitions within the grid, and you can see that where the dominance of coal has diminished. The ascendancy of natural gas has taken place. So natural gas has replaced coal, but now we're starting to see solar and wind ascend. It's still in the early days. All of that is kind of background noise to the fact that the grid has been relatively stable. So that's the takeaway there for the last 20 years. Now, my argument would be, and some of the folks will support this, that that's all about to change. Now, I pulled this graph out, and it's kind of just showing what the projection is for 2050. And this is kind of the status quo projection, where they're saying, okay, we're going to be seeing a steady increase in demand on the grid. We're going to see an ascendancy of solar as it becomes the dominant, wind secondarily dominant, renewables will take over the grid. That's all good. We still have some hydro. We'll see diminishing, no more new coal, no more new natural gas. We'll see solar plus storage, all of that. Now, this doesn't look all that dramatic. Although if you really analyze the numbers, it can be a little scary. But I wanted to show what this means in reality here. This graph, the projections just are a moving target. This is the projections from FERC for the last 2 years. And they were saying that we were going to see in 2022, they said that we would see a 2.6% growth of demand by 2028. Now they're upping that to a 4.7. So again, the numbers are relatively small, but the impact is really, really big. That is a tremendous error in estimation, basically missing it by 50%. So what happens if we start throwing those numbers into this demand curve? We start seeing this compounding rate of impact as you see a 4.7% increase on top of a 4.7% increase, and so on and so forth. So this is sort of a classic hockey stick curve here, where it goes along at a relatively stable pace, and then all of a sudden something happens that just causes the demand or causes this graph to kick up like a hockey stick. So I mentioned that for you, Chris, from up in Canada. So everybody knows hockey stick demand. So what's causing this dramatic increase in demand all of the sudden? And we're just entering into that phase of it. Well, one of these is the transition to electric vehicles. The transition to electric vehicles cannot be overstated, the amazing impact that's going to have on the grid. It initially has an impact of increasing demand. It's taking a very huge load that has traditionally been serviced from petroleum products and transitioning that huge load over to the electrical grid. Now, in the long run, it also has the ability or the promise of adding a lot of grid stability. But in the short run, it's a big load being dumped on here. We're also in the short run seeing a tremendous amount of investment in increased manufacturing capacity. In fact, this is the stated policy of the US government. COVID pointed out that we cannot continue to rely on overseas manufacturing of critical components because supply chain disruption, whether it's political or military or just natural disease-based like COVID was, we have to have better, more localized sourcing to avoid those kind of disruptions. At least that's the political current thought. Well, that involves a huge amount of investment in new manufacturing capacity, which then also involves a huge amount of investment in energy. And the energy that's being installed is electric because everything is being electrified. So we're seeing a transition of the automobile from petroleum to electric. Now we're seeing an increase in manufacturing capacity, but that's being transitioned from natural gas traditionally to electric. So that's going to be a big issue. And then, of course, data centers. And data centers, I have some more detailed information on that, but data centers are already a significant draw on the grid. In fact, about 4% of all of the electricity used in the grid is used to run data centers. And they're projecting a 15% increase annually in data center needs. So the world of AI and the world of cryptocurrency and all of these things are going to just put huge data center demands. And then there's the Jevons paradox, which is one of these cute things people like to throw around. But basically, that states that as energy gets less expensive and you begin to put in more and more efficiencies, you end up using more power. Because one efficiency leads to a demand in another place. The cost of the energy per unit is less and less and less. So why not use more and more and more of it? So that's kind of the paradox of conservation, is the more you're increasing your efficiencies, then the more you use of a thing. So there is a natural progression that goes on there as well for the increase in demand. So at this moment, before I jump into the details, again, I just want to periodically give folks a chance to jump in if you've got a comment or a question. So, right. So let me go into the EVs because I personally think this is going to be a huge thing. Well, if you look at the amount of energy, the US consumption of energy in total, about 30% of it, 28% of it, is for transportation. So currently that amount of our energy is not serviced through electric. It's serviced through gasoline, for example, other petroleums like diesel fuel, jet fuel, biofuels. These are almost all liquid petroleum sources. Now we're saying, okay, we want to transfer that over to electric. And the electric is, in fact, the estimates, the one I just saw last week, is that by 2030, we should see that 60% of all of the new vehicles sold in the US will be electric. So this is happening very, very quickly. And it's hard for me to get my head around the fact we've been talking about 2030 like it's a long way off, but it's only 6 years. It's one election cycle, basically one senator's term. So, all of these things are happening very, very quickly. So we're now saying, okay, over the next decade, for sure, we want to take what 28% of our energy uses and transition this from petroleum to electric. But we have not invested in the grid. Okay, so then we have manufacturing, new manufacturing. And I looked for some numbers on this, trying to get a sense of what this means, what the estimates are as far as percentages. I couldn't find it, but they're throwing out these numbers like $481 billion in new manufacturing investment. Is the grid ready for that? I saw some comments flash up where people are saying, okay, Bitcoin, and they're trying to use old coal power plants for running Bitcoin. In fact, even here, right in Marietta, Ohio, there's a retired coal power plant just up the road, and they have been talking about using that facility as a Bitcoin mining. I don't think they're talking about running the coal power plant, though. I think they're just saying this is just this pile of slag. Nobody else is going to relocate there. Maybe we can relocate because it's got all the transmission lines, so we can feed in huge amounts of electricity because the infrastructure is there, but we're not going to use the coal power plant. But one of the things that they were talking about at the ACES conference is basically small nuclear, right? Small nuclear keeps popping up, and that's a thing that you hear periodically. I personally feel like it has no future. It's too expensive. Plus there are problems. But it's a way that people who have lobbying power can get government money to explore it. So that's one of those things that I just don't see nuclear. Nuclear, when you look at the cost comparisons, nuclear is so far more expensive than all the alternatives. You just go, why would you do that? There's another one that keeps popping up about hydrogen. Hydrogen is going to be the new fuel source, and hydrogen, of course, is not really a generating fuel. It's a storage. It's a storage mechanism. You take power that's being generated, you convert. I mean, the way they like to talk about it, you convert water through electrolysis into oxygen and hydrogen, and then you use the hydrogen as a fuel source through fuel cells or whatever. Very inefficient energy-wise. At least under current technology, it takes more electricity to do the electrolysis than the power that you get out of the hydrogen after it's done. So it's a negative process, a little bit like ethanol, but making ethanol out of corn is a negative energy process, but that doesn't stop it because it's politically expedient. So we may see this happen with hydrogen, but not. There's too many problems with hydrogen. It's such a small electron that in order to store it, you've got to either cryogenically freeze it or put it under massive pressures. That takes energy. And when you're competing against, the thing it's competing against is batteries, and lithium ion batteries are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and hydrogen is still experimental. So why would you transition over to hydrogen when you have this cheap alternative? So that's where I come from. It's sort of like solar never got to be a thing until the alternatives, the fossil fuels, went up in price to the point where it became competitive. I don't see that with hydrogen. I personally don't. We always like to joke that hydrogen is the technology of the future and always will be. So, it's always 15 years off in the future. So, all right. Sodium batteries. Yeah, there's a lot of storage techniques out there. There's gravity storage. There's compressed air storage. There's wave technologies. Energy is in abundance. So, I think hydrogen has a place. I see some comments there, but not as an energy storage mechanism. It's just that hydrogen is used in the making of ammonia. It's used in the making in the fabrication of steel and aluminum. There's a need for hydrogen. I just think we need to transition how we make hydrogen from traditionally they use natural gas and they refine it down into its hydrogen components. We can make that greener. But that hydrogen that's being produced is not being produced as an energy system. It's being produced as an industrial input. And I just think that's where hydrogen is going to rest. Of course, been wrong before, probably will be again. Data centers. Yeah, data centers. Currently 4%. They're estimating that by 2026, in 2 years, it's going to double in the amount of energy required for data centers, which would take it up to about 6%. You can see it's not 8% because everything else is going up too. But and then by 2030, going to double again. So we're going to be seeing data centers as, again, a significant impactor on our grid and how the grid is organized, and these are going to be great, huge energy sucks. So we've seen politics where they say, oh, we want to encourage these data centers in our area. I think you're going to see that changing, because who's going to be responsible for updating the infrastructure to supply these big data hogs, or these big energy hogs? They don't employ that many people compared to the amount of energy they're consuming. So I think we may find that they're not a desirable tenant in a lot of situations. But they're going to have to be maybe co-located close to these energy generating facilities. Maybe locate them out with the solar farms. Then all the farmers can get upset about not only our farmlands being used for solar, but also you're taking them and making them into data centers. So we can have a culture war there. That'll be fun. Okay, so coal. So all of this is happening. As I mentioned, we're transitioning to the EV, we're increasing our manufacturing capacity, and we're increasing data. In fact, of any of the thing AI promises to be this transformative technology, well, it takes huge amounts of electricity. So if our economy is going to be based on a transition to a renewable energy and the integration of AI into everything, and at the same time, all of the techno bros are out there trading in crypto, which I think has the full faith and credit of a country less reliable than North Korea. So I don't quite understand why you would put your backing into something that has no backing. But that's not for me to decide. People are spending their money and their time and their energy on crypto. So all of these things are happening to create that hockey stick demand curve. At the same moment, we're shutting down traditional coal power plants, and we're shutting down traditional natural gas power plants. So these things are coalescing right here in this short-term period. That's why I'm saying between now and 2030, we have this transitional period that is ripe for problems. Okay, so we're shutting down the coal power plants. In 2010, there were 318 gigawatts of coal generating capacity in the United States. By 2030, it will be down to 80 gigawatts. I mean, that's significant. That's down to 20% or 25% of where it was just 15 years ago. So that's a significant source of power. In fact, the main source of power that is being eliminated, and it's being eliminated at a more and more rapid rate. And then we're starting to see natural gas shutdowns. Now, remember, over the last couple decades, we've seen a transition from coal to natural gas. That's been kind of the primary mover in the underlying grid structure. Well, these natural gas power plants are starting to get a little long in the tooth. 29 years on average is the age. And the average age of retired natural gas power plants is 35 years. Not surprisingly, 2030 happens to be 6 years off in the future, where the average age of most of your natural gas power plants are going to be 35 years old, retirement age in the world of power plants. We're already seeing a significant number of these natural gas power plants already being retired. In 2023, we saw that 58% of the power plants being retired were coal, but 40% of them were natural gas. So I think we're used to discussing natural gas or coal power plants being retired, but not so used to discussing that coal power plants are being retired. So what we're and also natural gas prices have been pretty volatile. So if I'm a utility and I'm going, okay, this year natural gas is costing me $4 a therm, and next year it's $8, and then it's down to $2, and then it's up to $9. I can't do good planning, So I may think about, even though my natural gas power plant is still not at its sell-by date, there's wind and solar are a much cheaper option, and the fuel source is extremely predictable, fact free for the most part. So, and we're already beginning to see some of the regulatory bodies. Last week we reported on this, that are refusing permission for them to shut down these power plants. So, because they're going, hey, we can't shut everything down because we still need some power out there. Which brings us to another issue with all of this, which is the, well, I'll get to it in a minute, but the delays in interconnecting. The other issue there, here, this is one I haven't heard a lot of people discussing, but transmission lines, huge, huge issue. According to the FERC study that was recently published, they estimate we need 91,000 miles of transmission lines, high voltage transmission lines, to meet the anticipated demand on the grid. 91,000 miles now, 2030, by 2035 at the outset. We're averaging adding 645 miles a year. Now, I may not be a whiz at math, but I don't think 645 goes into 91,000 less than 6 times, so we're not going to meet this goal. And actually, the amount of miles of transmission lines that are installed is declining. In 2021, the US only added 386 miles of lines. So if we need 91,000 and we're adding, let's say, roughly 500 miles a year, it's going to be what, 45 years before we meet this need, and the need is already current. So transmission, huge issue, a huge bottleneck here. So that's all happening at the same time that you're removing these coal power plants, these natural gas power plants. And then I don't think I put a slide here, but nuclear power plants. We're one oops away from the next nuclear disaster, which seem to happen pretty frequently. I was looking it up, and in my mind, there have been like 3 major nuclear disasters. There was 3 Mile Island in 1979. There was Chernobyl in 1986, and then there's Fukushima in 2011. And those were kind of the 3 major ones. But it turns out they're actually, at least according to Wikipedia, and of course they're never wrong, there were 28 nuclear disasters, really from 1957 to 2011. So 28 of these. And it's interesting because I heard a podcaster talking about nuclear and how safe nuclear is. And they threw out this little thing about more people died in Ted Kennedy's car than have ever died in a nuclear disaster. And I thought, okay, that's cute. But not according to, reality, obviously. He's basically saying no one ever died in a nuclear failure. But it turns out that that's not the case. And just with these 28 nuclear disasters, there were 45 people who were killed in the immediate explosions that took place at these nuclear power plants when they melted down. But it's estimated that there were many, many thousands of people who have died from cancer from the fallouts from Chernobyl, for example, and 3 Mile Island. Fukushima, they evacuated pretty well, but we're still dealing with the fallout there. So what would be the result? What would be the response to the next one? Because we know there will be one. Anything built by humans fails at some point or another. And so what will be our political response? What will be our, I would imagine there would be a call for most of these existing power plants to shut down. And as I mentioned earlier in the news, currently nuclear accounts for about 8%. So all of a sudden we're seeing another 8% pressure to close those things down. So that's another thing where our existing infrastructure is either wanting or is being retired. And the time it takes for new power plants to be approved to be connected to the grid, and far and away these new power plants are primarily wind and solar, but the average interconnection wait time now is 5 years. So if I want to install a power plant today to alleviate this upcoming shortage of power, well, they're not going to give me approval to start on it until 2029. How are we going to respond? How are we going to meet this crisis demand when we're seeing an increase in demand, a decrease in supply, and an inability of our regulatory environment to approve new projects that are economical in a timely manner? And then we add on to this climate change and all of the issues associated with climate change. And we're already beginning to see the power grid long in the tooth. So we're starting to see increases in power outages. This graph shows a dramatic increase in the amount that are weather related. And actually, when you look into the numbers, the length of time that the outages are there are getting more and more significant as well. So we've got an aging infrastructure that causes downtime. We have increasingly severe climate events that causes downtime. And we're seeing these longer, and we also see a regulatory body and administration that seems unable to respond in these. So other challenges, and then I'll throw it over to some questions and the like. The utilities seem to be mounting an increased war against solar. You see it at the residential level when you're trying to pull permits, the silliness that they throw in your way, to delay it. We see it in the 5-year delay for the larger systems. I think we're beginning to see that renewable energy is becoming more politicized. It's part of now the culture war narrative of politics. So if we were to see a change in administration in November, I think we would see a significant rollback of some of the progress that's been made in the transition to renewables, which I would argue is a little bit too little too late as it is, but we would see it delayed even further. So I think then it becomes kind of an every man for themselves. You then at the individual homeowner, the individual business, have to begin relying on a self-sustainable, mechanism, as far not a unified grid, which we've been relying on, but basically we're starting to see this happen with the integration of batteries, the integration of standalone modes, the integration of the electric vehicle. All of this in the long term is going to make everything better. In the short term, in this 6-year window between now and 2030, I just see things coalescing to where we're going to have some problems. So that said, let's see if you've got any comments. Yeah, Pete, you got a comment there?
This might be off topic, but since I sense we're running out of time, and I also sense you know the answer to this, in the chat there was a good question about about demand charges for EV chargers, and would there not be a software routine that could reduce the current requirement every 10 minutes for 5 minutes or something like that, so that the peak demand for whatever period the utility measures could be reduced? What do you think of that? I think you guys onto something.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. You could play with it. All of these things can be programmed for sure. Because as you say, demand charges, and this is primarily a commercial thing. It's not so much a residential. Most residents don't get charged demand charges, but you're billed at a rate based on the highest 15-minute consumption period. It can vary, but that's a pretty standard within over the course of a month. So you get a real high spike in electricity. It could have significant impacts on your electric bill, even though over the course of the month you consume the same amount. It's when and how and in what intensity that affects your billing. You could play with computer programming, I'm sure, and manipulate that. That may be why the utilities are starting to go, you know what? Yeah. Why don't we come up with our own rate structure that deals with just EV charging? I think one of the difficulties with EV charging, let's say that you're running a commercial manufacturing plant and you've got your workforce comes into work and you've got 100 people with EVs parked in your parking lot and you've provided them with charging stations. So that creates a battery backup system for you. You can regulate how those things are charging, and you can manipulate it, and you can draw from it when you need to reduce your load demand and add to it when you don't need. So if you're running a big motor in your factory, you could pull some of the power from the EVs to modulate that. And then when you're not, you can feed power back to it. But the idea of an individual traveling across country and plugging into a gas station, they want full charge when they want it. So that's not going to be as easily controlled. So
Well, I agree with that, but I guess I would say if the charge was, say, 30 minutes versus 40 minutes, but for example, half the price because we could duck under the demand charges, I'd be a little more amenable to taking longer to charge for
yeah,
greatly reduced price.
my guess is if we did that, the utilities would respond by changing their demand charge structure to
Probably.
fall within. And it's this war of we do this. It's that old thing, you build a 10-foot wall and somebody builds a 12-foot ladder. It's like, so it's probably not a long-term solution, but on an individual basis, if I were a clever programmer of bi-directional charging stations, I would give you that option.
Okay, J for us old farts, it's Spy versus Spy from Mad
Oh
Magazine.
yeah. That's right. Uh-huh. Or Goofus and
Okay.
Gallant from Highlights, right? Anybody else have any questions? I see something in chat. I wonder ISP market understand. Oh, I can't read through the whole question. Yeah, Pete. Oh, I just see Pete. All right. Anybody have?
I was just saying, I wonder if you could look at the way internet service providers and cable content delivery, how that world has evolved and innovated in order to deal with demand pricing. If that might be one way of formulating a model to consider how energy pricing could also then be aligned to demand related and type of demand related charging.
Yep, that's a good point. In fact, I raised it with one of the regulators at this conference because I was involved in the telecom industry during that transition from plain old telecom to the world of the internet, and it was quite a big transition. And the vision I was trying to get them to acknowledge or lay out was, are we going to see a regulated and deregulated side of the house within the energy marketplace? Because let's say that Apple decides to get into the energy business, and they already are to a certain extent. They're building facilities to solar arrays and the like through power purchase agreements or direct ownership to service their data requirements. Well, they're finding that it's very profitable. So let's say they decide, okay, I want to expand this business. I got lots of cash. I want to go out now and find customers, and I want to be a utility. Well, they generate extra power, but the utility that they're connected to says, we're only going to pay you wholesale. Apple says, that's not good enough. I want to sell this retail. And they go through some litigation or through paying off, politicians or whatever it is. And they are given permission to access the grid and pay rent for the portion of the grid they're using. Well, then they could serve their power onto the grid, and a customer could take it off regardless of where they are geographically. Power goes onto the grid, power goes off of the grid. The rest of it is just accounting. So then if you're in that mode in your Apple and you go, okay, well, then I want to create the iPower network. So all of you customers out there who have your own solar arrays, you remember AEP and First Energy and Duke, they're not paying you, they're just paying you wholesale. We'll put you into the iPower marketplace, and your customers can decide how much they're going to pay you for your power. And we will simply we'll receive a PayPal transaction fee, for this energy exchange. And now they become the largest utility in the country, but they're not owning their transmission lines. They're not owning those power plants. They're simply facilitating the exchange of power from one producer to a consumer. And that is not something that falls under the regulated side of the house when it comes to utilities. So do you then create a deregulated system and a regulated system? That's what happened in the telecommunications world. And the deregulated system will evolve and change and morph so much faster and be much more competitively nimble than any regulated system that requires 6 months to have a hearing to discuss whether they should have a meeting, to discuss whether they should consider a motion, So I was disappointed because clearly in their way of thinking, this will never happen. And clearly in my way of thinking, it's inevitable. So so there's a culture clash. And unfortunately, I don't think the regulators are ready for it. So that makes me worried. Any other comments here before we call it a day? Okay, well, hearing none, we will see you next week. Thanks for joining. Bye-bye.